Hi, in this video, we are going to talk about how to organize your proposal essay. But first, let's review what you need in order to have a successful proposal. First, you want to explain the problem as thoroughly as possible. This includes how that problem came about, who it impacts and how, and what would happen if nothing is done to solve that problem. Next, you go into the specifics of your solution. This would include any cost involved and who would pay those costs, labor and who would do that labor. If it's something that would need the attention of any community or political leaders, how would you approach them with this proposal? Then you would go on to justify to the reader why this proposal should be enacted. And this is using what we've talked about with ethos, logos, and pathos, and using those skills appropriately. And then you have to overcome anyone who might have an argument against your proposal. This could be taxpayers, people in the community, any stakeholders of businesses who might be affected by your solution. So you want to think through who would um, be against your solution, and then you want to think, how do you overcome their counter argument to your solution? Okay, so like I promised a few weeks ago when we first started talking about the proposal, this is not something that you're going to do all at once. We're going to take it section by section. So that first point that we just talked about, presenting the problem, that will be your argument essay. You're arguing the problem and that it needs to be solved. So this is your introduction and your thesis, what I just talked about, going into detail about who it affects, how, why, and then what would happen if nothing is done. So if I use my example of plastic straws, if my proposal is that we need to do something to ban plastic straws, this is where I would go into detail as to um, how long plastic straws have been around. It's actually only been in the last few decades. The problems that it's causing, mostly in the ocean. If I can find any really concrete examples, that's where I want to put it. Um, I might even go into the chemical makeup of a straw and what happens when it breaks down into the ocean and the problems it causes for our oceans, for our sea life, and for us because that's part of our food chain. So, as much as I can get into the nitty gritty of why this problem needs to be dealt with, that's going to go a long way in convincing your audience when you get to the next part, which is the solution. So now I want to move on to my solution. In my first part, I have argued my problem, and hopefully my audience is on board and they see the problem, and now they're ready to hear about the solution. And this is where I give them as much detail as possible, how it will solve the problem, how it will actually work. It's not enough to say, well, if I just get rid of plastic straws, it's going to solve the problem. I need to go into detail. We can't live without straws in our current society. We use them all the time when we're out going through drive-through, at a sit-down dinner, barbecues, cookouts, what have you. Plastic straws are just a given. So how are we going to change that? Well, if I can't get rid of straws, I'm probably going to have to suggest a new material. So that could be either be going back to paper straws, which are terrible um, because they disintegrate quickly, but they also means that they won't sit in landfills or in our oceans. Other alternatives are silicone and bamboo. Um, Another alternative is to ask places like restaurants and drive-throughs to not automatically hand out straws unless somebody asks for it, or to even mold a different type of cup that doesn't require a straw. For people who may have issues with drinking without a straw, we could have those alternative products in place. But I also need to talk about how much this would cost, how much this would cost the companies who produce straws or the restaurants and whatnot who pass out the straws. How long will it take to get this to go into effect and what will it cost in the long run? So these are all the things that you need to take into account. A good thing to do also is to find solutions that have already either been implemented or proposed. For example, going back to plastic, there's a lot of countries who are now banning single-use plastics. Obviously, that was probably a very long road for them to go down, but researching how they did it can help me with this problem, and I can use that as a source for my solution to show my audience that it can be done and what the effects were once it was done. Next, you need to think about who would oppose your solution. Now, this doesn't have to take a huge portion of your essay, so don't think that each of these sections have to be equal in size. This could be a paragraph. Sometimes I've seen students actually take counter arguments and weave them into their solution. So, for example, if I'm talking about my straws and I talk about paper straws, I could say a lot of people would argue paper straws are not great because they do disintegrate so quickly. And of course, we're using paper, which means we're taking down trees. But here's my counter argument to that argument within that paragraph, and then go on to the next point of your solution, um, bamboo or silicone, why some people might have a problem with those two materials, and then explain how that could be overcome. So your counter argument can be a separate paragraph all its own or several paragraphs, however long you need to address those, or you can weave them into your solution, whichever works best for you. The important thing is that you do address them because people are always going to oppose any solution. There's always going to be someone out there that says no. So you have to think through that. Who's going to oppose my plastic straws? Well, obviously, anyone who's in the plastic straw industry is going to have a problem with that. The reason would be obvious. That's their bread and butter. People who may have disabilities who cannot drink from a cup without a straw. That is a legitimate concern. So I would need to address that and say, yes, I know some people do need straws. Here's a solution. Restaurants could have a alternative material straw on hand for those people, or people could, you know, be prepared and carry their own straws, which is becoming a thing. But I want to explain to the audience that I understand what the counter arguments to my solution could be, and that I have thought through to how those issues might be handled. I'm not going to make everyone happy, but I'm going to try and come up with the least problematic solution to this problem. So now it's time for the final part, your final boss, the conclusion. This is where you summarize your main points of your argument. So you reiterate your problem, you go back through the main points of how your solution will work, and then you want to end on a call to action, some way of getting your audience to feel like, yes, this is a solid argument, this is a good solution, how can I help? So if I'm talking about my plastic straws, I want my audience at the end of my essay to at least think about it. Next time they go through a drive-through, they'll at least notice, yes, I'm immediately handed a plastic straw, sometimes two or three. Even if you only have one drink, they get a little enthusiastic. Or maybe thinking when they go out to eat, I don't need a straw for my cup. Or how they can maybe carry something around, or notice in stores that they're starting to sell personal straws that people can carry with them so that they don't use those plastic straws. So you're trying to grow awareness and a willingness to see the problem and try to be part of the solution when you get to the end of this essay. So to see all four parts in action, there is an example essay in this week's module. It's a real student essay where she had the exact same assignment as you. Is it a perfect essay? Not by any means, but it is a good, solid essay that shows you each four of these parts in action. I also have it color coded so you can see when one part ends and the next part begins. So you can kind of go through and say, okay, this is the problem, here's the solution, here's where she talked about the counter arguments and the conclusion. So this will be in your module. You take a look at it. If you have any questions, reach out to me. The only thing you need to work on this week is that argument section, that first part where you're talking about the problem. That's what you're going to work on and turn in this week. Next week, we move on to the solution. And that is all for now.